There's a list that historians do not argue about anymore. It is not hidden. It is not buried in some forgotten archive. It is not locked behind a paywall or sealed in a vault. It sits in museum cases in Jerusalem, Cairo, Athens, and Chicago. It sits in academic journals that almost nobody outside the field ever reads. It sits in the patient, methodical reports of excavation directors who have been pulling objects out of the dirt for over 100 years and quietly writing down what they found. It is a list of inventions that emerged during the biblical era, technologies that were built by human hands, used by ordinary people, and described in the pages of the Hebrew Bible long before a single archaeologist held a trowel. For most of the last 2 centuries, skeptics dismissed those descriptions as folklore, embellishment, religious exaggeration, the kind of detail you add to a story to make it sound grander than it was. Then the digging started, and one by one the things the text said existed began coming out of the ground. Not approximations, not vaguely similar objects. The specific technologies in the specific places, at the specific times the Bible claimed they were there. That is what we are exploring today. 10 inventions from the biblical era that historians have traced through archaeological evidence. Not a legend, not a myth, not a metaphor. Physical objects with carbon dates, with inscriptions, with measurable engineering tolerances, sitting in glass cases right now, waiting for anyone to walk up and look at them. And when you start to see these inventions together, not one by one in isolation, but as a pattern, a much larger question begins to emerge. A question about what kind of world the people in those texts actually lived in. A question about how much of what we were told was primitive was actually nothing of the kind. If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe and turn on notifications. What we cover on this channel is the part of history the textbook gives you in 1 paragraph and the archaeology gives you in 100 pages. You are exactly where you need to be. Let us begin. The first invention on this list does not look impressive when you first encounter it. You walk into it, literally. You wade through cold spring water in the dark with the rock pressing in on both sides, and you keep walking for the better part of half an hour before you come out the other end. It is a tunnel. Specifically, it is the tunnel that King Hezekiah of Judah ordered cut through the bedrock beneath Jerusalem in roughly 701 BCE. As the Assyrian army of Sennacherib closed on the city. The Bible describes it twice in 2 Kings 20:20 and 2 Chronicles 32:30. For centuries, those passages were read as the kind of confident detail religious texts often add to make a king sound capable. A tunnel through solid rock, dug from both ends, meeting precisely in the middle without modern surveying tools in the 8th century BCE. It strained belief. Then, in 1880, a young boy wading through the tunnel for fun noticed something carved into the wall. He told an archaeologist. The archaeologist came back with light, and what they found was the Salome inscription, 6 lines of ancient Hebrew carved into the limestone, describing the exact moment the 2 work crews heard each other's voices through the last 3 cubits of rock and broke through. The tunnel is 533 meters long. It carries water from the Gihon spring outside the city wall to the pool of Siloam inside it. The elevation drop from one end to the other is approximately 30 centimeters. Across roughly 1,700 feet of underground bedrock, the engineers maintained a gradient precise enough that water still flows through it today, nearly 2,700 years later. Geoarchaeologists at the Israeli Geological Survey have studied the tunnel's path, and the working hypothesis is that the crews followed a natural karstic fissure in the limestone, which still does not explain how they coordinated direction, depth, and meeting point through stone. Ask not whether the Bible accurately describes the tunnel. The Salome inscription carved by the men who dug it is now in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. The tunnel itself is still there. Walk into it. The water will be at your knees. The second invention is, in some ways, the inverse of the first. The tunnel was a physical structure that endured. This one was a mental structure that spread. In the late 19th century, archaeologists working at Byblos on the Lebanese coast began uncovering inscriptions in a script that did not look like the cuneiform of Mesopotamia, and did not look like the hieroglyphs of Egypt. It used 22 simple linear signs. Each sign stood for a single consonant sound. There were no logograms. There were no ideograms. There were no hundreds of memorized symbols. The whole writing system could be learned by an ordinary literate adult in a few weeks, rather than a lifetime in a scribal school. This was the Phoenician alphabet, fully developed by roughly 1050 BCE. The Ahiram sarcophagus, dated to around the 10th century BCE and now in the National Museum of Beirut, carries one of the earliest fully formed examples. From the Phoenician coast, this 22-letter system was carried by traders into Greece, where vowels were added, into Aramaic-speaking lands, where it became the parent of Hebrew square script, and eventually into Latin, where it became the alphabet you are reading right now. The Phoenicians lived next door to ancient Israel. They sold King Solomon his cedar. They traded along every coast the Hebrew Bible describes. And the alphabet they refined, the technology that finally separated literacy from the priesthood, became the substrate on which the Hebrew scriptures themselves were eventually written down. The third invention does not look like an invention at all. It looks like a hole in a rock. If you have ever hiked through the hill country of Judea or walked the ruins of an Iron Age village in the Galilee, you have probably stepped over one without noticing it. A shallow basin cut into bedrock, a channel running off to one side, a second, deeper basin at the bottom of the slope, a few worn stones nearby that, if you knew what to look for, would resolve into the remains of a wooden beam and a counterweight. This is an olive press, and the one that matters for this list, the earliest beam and weight press ever excavated in Israel, was pulled out of the ground at Tel Dan, in the far north of the country, in a stratum dating to the 11th century BCE. That date matters. The 11th century BCE is the period the Hebrew Bible calls the time of the Judges. It is the era of Samson, Deborah, and Gideon. It is the world immediately before the rise of the Israelite monarchy. And the technology being pulled from that stratum is not a primitive curiosity. It is the prototype of an industrial machine. The press worked on a principle that any modern engineer would recognize instantly. Crushed olives were packed into woven baskets and stacked beneath a long wooden beam. One end of the beam was anchored into a socket cut into the stone wall. The other end was loaded with heavy stone weights, sometimes weighing hundreds of kilograms. The leverage compressed the baskets, forcing the oil out and down into a collection vat. It was a Class 1 lever applied to agriculture 2.5 millennia before the Industrial Revolution that history books actually name. And it was not a one-village curiosity. At Tel Mikne, the Philistine city the Bible calls Ekron, archaeologists found more than 100 industrial oil press installations dating to the 7th century BCE. Estimates from the dig published by Seymour Gitton and Trude Dothan place Ekron's annual production at roughly 1,000 tons of oil at peak operation, making it the largest known industrial oil complex in the ancient Near East. The Hebrew word Gethsemane, the garden where the Gospels placed Jesus on the night of his arrest, literally means oil press. When the New Testament chose that location, it was not picking a poetic setting. It was named after its industrial function, the same way we might say the refinery or the foundry. This was not subsistence farming. This was an export economy. Oil from this region was shipped to Egypt, to Assyria, to Phoenicia, traded for cedar and copper and grain. The text said it. The dirt confirms it. The fourth invention is harder. Literally, in 1 Samuel 13, verses 19 through 22, the Hebrew Bible records something that for decades scholars treated as obvious folklore. There was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel, the text says. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. The passage goes on to describe how Israelite farmers had to travel to Philistine territory just to have their plowshares and mattocks sharpened, and how on the day of battle there was not a sword or spear in the hand of any Israelite soldier, only in the hands of King Saul and his son Jonathan. For most of the 20th century, that passage was read as nationalistic embarrassment. A later author invented an excuse for an early military weakness: a storyteller's flourish. Then the iron started coming out of the ground at Tel Beth Shemesh, at Ekron, at Ashkelon, at every major Philistine site along the southern coastal plain. Archaeologists working through the late 20th and early 21st centuries began to recover something striking: iron tools, iron weapons, iron-working slag. Forged remains, concentrated in the Philistine cities, dating to the late 12th and 11th centuries BCE, the exact period the Bible places the Philistine ascendancy over Israel. In the Central Highlands, where the early Israelite settlements were located, the iron simply was not there, not in the same quantities, not in the same diagnostic concentrations. The Iron Age in the broader ancient Near East began around 1200 BCE, when the collapse of the Bronze Age cut off the long-distance tin trade and forced regional powers to develop substitute metallurgy. The Philistines, who arrived on the Levantine coast as part of the Sea People's migrations in roughly that same window, appear to have brought iron-working knowledge with them. Their neighbors did not have it. What the Bible describes as a Philistine monopoly is not folklore. It is a technology gap in the precise generations the text claims it existed, confirmed by the metallurgical record of the dirt itself. Now pause. 4 inventions in. Step back. Look at what they share. A tunnel that the engineers carved through bedrock and the inscription that proves they did. An alphabet that turned writing from a priestly secret into a public skill. A press that turned olives into an industrial export. An iron monopoly that the Bible names, and the archaeology confirms generation by generation. In every one of these cases, the standard skeptical position was the same. The text is religious. The text is propaganda. The text is later embellished. The technology described does not fit the period claimed. And in every one of these cases, the spade has answered, not by proving theology, not by validating belief, by doing something much simpler, by pulling the specific object with the specific date out of the specific layer of earth the text said it would be in. This is no longer one anomaly, this is a pattern, and the next 6 inventions on this list make the pattern impossible to look away from. The 5th invention is so ordinary, so universally familiar, that you have to actively work to see it as an invention at all. It is a wheel, specifically a horizontal disc of stone or wood mounted on a vertical spindle, that spins fast enough to take a wet lump of clay and pull it upward into a symmetrical vessel under the pressure of the potter's hands. The first potter's wheels emerged in southern Mesopotamia somewhere between 4,500 and 3,500 BCE. A stone potter's wheel pulled from the ruins of the Sumerian city of Ur has been dated to approximately 3,129 BCE and is one of the oldest physical examples on Earth. Older fragments, fired vessels showing the unmistakable concentric striations of wheel throwing, push the date further back still. By the time the Hebrew Bible's narrative begins, the potter's wheel was already 2,000 years old. By the time the prophets were writing, it had become so deeply embedded in the daily life of the Eastern Mediterranean that it functioned as a metaphor everyone understood without explanation. In Jeremiah chapter 18, the prophet says, "Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he was working at his wheel. And the vessel that he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to do." That metaphor only works if the technology is invisible from familiarity, the way we today might say behind the wheel or off the assembly line, and assume the listener knows exactly what we mean. Jeremiah did not have to explain how a potter's wheel worked. His audience had grown up watching one spin. Archaeologically, the evidence is everywhere. Wheel-thrown pottery has been recovered from every major biblical period site in Israel: Hazor, Lachish, Megiddo, Beth Shean, Jerusalem itself. Israeli archaeologist David Ben Shlomo and others have published detailed typologies tracing the diagnostic shapes of Iron Age Judean pottery, used today to date strata with extraordinary precision. The potter's wheel is one of those rare inventions that emerged in deep antiquity and never genuinely changed in principle. The kick wheel a Galilean potter used in the 1st century works on the same physics as the electric wheel in a contemporary studio. 5,000 years of refinement, and the underlying mechanism is identical. The sixth invention is sitting in your front door right now. In 1843, the French Egyptologist Émile Priest-Davin published drawings of wooden mechanisms found in Egyptian tombs that he had recognized as locks. The basic design had been used in Egypt since approximately 2000 BCE. A wooden post was mounted to the door. A horizontal wooden bolt slid through that post into a socket cut into the doorframe. Small wooden pins, gravity-fed, dropped down through holes in the top of the bolt, fixing it in place. To open the lock, the user inserted a long wooden key shaped like a horizontal comb with pegs rising from its surface. When the key was pushed into a slot beneath the bolt and lifted, the pegs raised the pins exactly far enough to clear the bolt, which could then be slid back. This is a pin tumbler lock, and the oldest physical lock of this kind ever recovered was found in the ruins of the Assyrian palace at Khorsabad, on the outskirts of Nineveh, dated to approximately 704 BCE, within decades of Hezekiah's tunnel, within the lifetimes of Isaiah and Micah. In 1861, a Connecticut inventor named Linus Yale Jr. filed a patent for what he called a modern pin tumbler cylinder lock. It is the lock in nearly every door in the modern world. Its mechanism, pins of varying length lifted to a precise shear line by the cuts in a key, is, in its essentials, the same mechanism the Egyptians used 4,000 years ago and the Assyrians used at Khorsabad. The materials changed, the geometry shrank. The principle did not. And the Hebrew Bible knows this technology. Isaiah 22:22 records, "And the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder. So he shall open, and none shall shut, and he shall shut, and none shall open." This is not a metaphor about a small modern key worn on a ring. The keys of this period were large wooden objects, sometimes 30 centimeters or more in length, carried on the shoulder by a servant or steward as a visible symbol of household authority. The biblical image is not decorative, it is technically accurate to the locking hardware of the period. The same is true of Judges 3:23, where the assassin Ehud locks the doors of the king's chamber behind him as he escapes, a sequence that only makes mechanical sense if the lock could be operated from the outside, which the Egyptian pin tumbler design specifically allowed. 6 inventions in. Step back again for a moment. Notice what has happened to the texture of the list. We began with monumental engineering, a tunnel, a writing system, an industrial press, a metallurgical revolution. Things you would expect to see in a museum, behind glass, with a placard. We have now moved into the everyday. The wheel a village potter used, the lock on a household door, the objects ordinary people in biblical-era cities touched and operated without thinking, the way you operate the lock on your own front door without thinking, every single day. This is the part of the archaeological record that gets lost in the popular telling. The biblical world was not a world of robed figures wandering through symbolic landscapes. It was a world of working economies, of mechanical infrastructure, of technologies refined across generations and traded across borders. And the inventions that come next push that world further than most modern readers realize. The 7th invention is not a machine. It is something more difficult to build. It is a way of thinking. In 1862, an American antiquities dealer named Edwin Smith bought a damaged papyrus scroll in Luxor, Egypt. He could not fully read it. Almost no one alive at that point could. The script was hieratic, the cursive form of Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the systematic decoding of the language was still a generation of scholarship away. The scroll passed through Smith's hands, through his daughter's hands, and finally, in 1920, into the hands of James Henry Breasted, the founding director of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. When Breasted finished his translation in 1930, what he had on his desk was the oldest surgical textbook in the history of the world. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is a scroll just under 5 meters long. The copy that survives dates to roughly 1600 BCE, but linguistic analysis indicates it is a transcription of an original composition from approximately 3000 BCE, meaning the medical thinking it records was being practiced in Egypt around the same period the pyramids at Giza were being designed. The papyrus presents 48 clinical cases, mostly traumatic injuries to the head, neck, and upper torso. Each case follows the same rigorous structure, a title naming the injury, a careful physical examination, a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a recommended treatment. What is remarkable is what the text does not contain: almost no magic, almost no incantations, almost no appeals to demons or gods. This is not religious medicine. This is empirical medicine. The author distinguishes injuries he expects to treat successfully from injuries he categorizes as an ailment with which I will contend, meaning difficult but treatable, and injuries he categorizes as an ailment not to be treated, meaning the prognosis is hopeless and intervention would be cruel. That triage logic is identical in structure to the triage logic taught in modern emergency medicine. The papyrus contains the earliest known references to the brain in any human language. It describes the meninges, the membrane covering the brain. It describes cerebrospinal fluid. It correlates specific cranial injuries with specific neurological symptoms: paralysis of a limb on the opposite side of the body, loss of speech, changes in pupil response, observations that are clinically accurate by 21st century standards. Hippocrates, whom the Western tradition credits as the father of medicine, was born around 460 BCE. The Edwin Smith papyrus predates him by more than 1,000 years. The diagnostic structure he is credited with originating already existed in writing in Egypt, when the patriarchs in Genesis were said to have been walking through that same country. The eighth invention transformed light into a material. For most of human history, if you wanted to look through something, you looked through air or through water. There were no transparent solids. None. The chemistry of creating one, taking ordinary sand, heating it past 1,500 degrees Celsius with the right fluxes, and cooling it without crystallization, was the closest thing the ancient world had to alchemy. The earliest confirmed glass objects, small beads recovered from sites in Mesopotamia and Egypt, date to the middle of the second millennium BCE. But the breakthrough, the moment when glass stopped being an accidental byproduct of metallurgy and became a deliberate industry, was identified in 2005 by Thilo Rehren of University College London and Edgar Pusch of the Palazius Museum, working at the site of Kontir on the eastern Nile Delta. Kontir was Pi-Ramesses, the capital of Pharaoh Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE. What Rehren and Pusch found there were the remains of a glass factory, specialized crucibles, glass-coated furnace fragments, production waste, color additives, the complete infrastructure of an industrial glassworks operating under royal control around 1250 BCE. The product was traded internationally. The Uluburun shipwreck, recovered off the coast of Turkey and dated to approximately 1300 BCE, was carrying glass ingots in shapes that matched the molds found at Kontir. Glass from Egypt has been chemically identified in royal contexts as far away as Mycenae and Mesopotamia. This was a luxury material, more valuable in some periods than gold, traded as bullion across the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Hebrew Bible knows this material. In Job 28, verse 17, the text places gold and glass. Most translations render the Hebrew word as crystal, but the consensus among lexicographers is that the term refers to clear or translucent glass, side by side in a list of valuables that wisdom is said to exceed. The detail only makes sense if the audience already understood glass as a precious substance, which, in the period the book of Job describes, they would have. 8 inventions in. This is the moment to stop and name what is now impossible to miss. We did not begin this list with theology. We began it with archaeology, with excavation reports, with carbon dates, with objects in museum cases, and in every single case so far, the same thing has happened. A specific technology described in the biblical text, a specific period the text places it in, a specific archaeological discovery confirming that the technology existed in that period, in that place, at that scale. A tunnel under Jerusalem, an alphabet at Byblos, a press at Tel Dan, iron at Ekron, a wheel at Ur, a lock at Khorsabad, a surgical textbook in Luxor, a glass factory in the Delta. The biblical world was not a primitive backdrop against which religious stories were told. It was a working civilization, embedded in a network of working civilizations, using technologies whose physical remains we can still hold in our hands. And the final two inventions on this list show just how far the reach of that civilization actually extended. The ninth invention is the reason the other nine traveled. For most of human history, the sea was a barrier. You could fish along the coast. You could paddle a reed boat through a river delta. But the open Mediterranean, with its sudden squalls and its weeks out of sight of land, was a place small craft did not return from. The civilization that finally solved that problem, and in doing so stitched the eastern and western halves of the ancient world together, lived on a narrow strip of coastline that the Hebrew Bible calls Phoenicia. The Phoenicians were master shipwrights by roughly 1000 BCE, and the engineering breakthrough that made their dominance possible was a joinery technique called mortise and tenon. Instead of lashing planks together with rope, the way most earlier Mediterranean shipbuilders had, Phoenician craftsmen cut precisely shaped tongues into the edge of each plank, the tenons, and corresponding rectangular slots, the mortises, into the planks they joined to. Hardwood pegs locked the joints in place. The result was a hull that was effectively a single carved object, watertight, flexible enough to absorb the punishment of ocean swells, and structurally strong enough to survive storms that would have torn earlier vessels apart. The physical proof of this technology came out of the seabed off the coast of Spain. The wreck known as Mazaron II, discovered near the coast of Murcia and dated to approximately 600 BCE, is one of the most completely preserved ancient ships ever recovered. The mortise and tenon joinery is visible. The cedar and pine planking is intact. The vessel is small, a coastal trader rather than a war galley, but the construction technique it demonstrates is the same technique that built the larger Phoenician biramies depicted on the reliefs from the palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh, dated to the late 8th century BCE. Those reliefs, now in the British Museum, show two-tiered oared warships hauling cedar timber from the Lebanese coast. The bow rises into a carved horse's head. The technology is unmistakable. The Hebrew Bible records the consequences. In 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 26 through 28, the text describes a joint maritime venture between Solomon and Hiram, king of Tyre. Solomon built ships at Etzion-Geber on the Gulf of Aqaba. Hiram supplied the Phoenician sailors who knew how to operate them. The fleet sailed to a place the text calls Ophir and returned with gold. The location of Ophir is still debated. Southern Arabia, the Horn of Africa, and the Indus coast have all been proposed, but the existence of the trade is no longer in question. Ezekiel chapter 27, written in the 6th century BCE, reads like an inventory of Tyrian maritime commerce. Cedar from Lebanon, oaks from Bashan, linen from Egypt, silver and iron and tin and lead from Tarshish, slaves and bronze from Greece, ivory and ebony from the south. It is not a poem. It is a manifest. The Phoenician ship was the physical infrastructure on which the cultural infrastructure of the biblical world moved. The alphabet from chapter 1 traveled west on these hulls. The glass from chapter 4 traveled in their holds. The world of the Hebrew Bible was a connected world precisely because these ships existed. The 10th invention is the one that turned a desert into a treasury. About 30 kilometers north of the modern Israeli city of Eilat, in a stretch of furnace-hot sandstone called the Timna Valley, there are ancient copper mines, thousands of them. Vertical shafts cut into the rock, galleries running for hundreds of meters underground, slag heaps the size of small hills, the discarded waste of an industrial smelting operation that ran for centuries. For most of the 20th century, the consensus dating of these mines was approximately the 13th century BCE, the period when Egyptian New Kingdom pharaohs controlled the southern Levant. That dating was rooted in pottery typology and in the assumption that any large-scale operation of this kind must have been imperial in origin. The Bible's references to a great copper economy in the time of David and Solomon, the bronze pillars Hiram of Tyre cast for the temple in 1 Kings chapter 7, the bronze sea and the bronze altars and the staggering quantities of bronze listed in 1 Chronicles were read as later embellishment. In 2013, a team led by Erez Ben Yosef of Tel Aviv University excavated a site within Timnah known as Slaves Hill. The site was an intact smelting camp on a defensible mesa. The arid climate had preserved organic material with extraordinary completeness. Date pits, olive pits, fragments of cloth, fragments of rope, animal dung. Each of those organic samples was radiocarbon dated at Oxford. The results were not ambiguous. The copper operation at Slaves Hill was active in the 10th century BCE, the exact period the Hebrew Bible places the united monarchy of David and Solomon. The dating was so consistent across so many independent samples that the previous consensus collapsed within a few years of publication. The identity of the operators is still debated. Ben Yosef and his collaborators have argued that the evidence points to the early Edomite kingdom, the semi-nomadic confederation the Bible places east and south of Israel, with whom the Israelite monarchy was sometimes at war and sometimes in alliance. Other archaeologists have argued for direct Israelite control during periods of expansion under David. What is no longer debated is the existence of a sophisticated, organized, large-scale copper production economy in the southern Levant during the exact century the Bible describes one. Ben Yosef's team has also recovered evidence of donkey caravans, fortified gatehouses, long-distance grain imports to feed the workforce, and a managed timber supply that eventually collapsed the local ecosystem. The same kind of industrial signature any modern mining operation leaves behind. This is the 10th invention, not the copper itself, which had been smelted in smaller quantities for thousands of years before. The invention is the system, the organization, the capacity to run an industrial extraction operation in the middle of a desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest city, with supply chains and security infrastructure and labor management 3,000 years ago. Now look at what is on the table, a tunnel cut through bedrock from both ends with sub-meter precision, with the engineer's own inscription on the wall describing the moment they met, an alphabet of 22 signs that became the parent of nearly every script the modern world reads, a beam and weight press that turned olives into an industrial export and gave a garden in Jerusalem the name oil press, an iron monopoly that the Bible blamed on the Philistines, and that the metallurgical record at Ekron and Beth Shemesh has now confirmed generation by generation. A potter's wheel so embedded in daily life that a prophet could use it as a metaphor without explaining it. A pin tumbler lock whose mechanism is identical in principle to the lock in your front door tonight. A surgical textbook from Egypt that described the brain 1,000 years before Hippocrates was born. A glass factory in the Nile Delta whose ingots have been pulled from a shipwreck off the coast of Turkey. A shipbuilding technique that knit the Mediterranean into a single trading economy. A copper industry in the deep desert dated by carbon to the exact century the Bible places David and Solomon. 10 inventions, 10 verified archaeological findings, 10 cases where the standard skeptical reading of the biblical text was that it could not be accurate, and 10 cases where the dirt has now been answered. The question this list raises is not whether the Bible records real technology. That question has been settled item by item by people who do not work for any church and who answer to peer review. The question is what else the text describes that the next excavation is going to confirm. Somewhere in Israel, or Lebanon, or Egypt, or Iraq, an archaeologist is sweeping dust off an object right now. A weight, a seal, a pipe, a piece of metal in a layer of charcoal. By the end of this year, it will have a carbon date and a publication, and it will quietly slot into a passage of text that has been sitting on the page waiting for almost 3,000 years. The list of 10 will not stay 10 for long. It never has.